Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me today. Did you know that prior to invading New York, the British unsuccessfully attempted to invade South Carolina, a failure that likely changed the course of history? That General Howe, with numerous opportunities to put Washington away once and for all, kept slow playing his hand and likely lost his best opportunity to win the war. And that the first submarine ever was invented by an American and used during the Revolutionary War. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more in episode 61. Washington continues to struggle and Howe continues to delay. Hello, everyone, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States, episode 61. Glad to have you here. Last week, we covered the Noble Train of Artillery and the Battle of Long Island, a battle that was an epic disaster for Washington and his men, and we saw them retreating from the southwest region of Long Island across the East River into Manhattan. And we will jump into that. But before we get into that, I'd like to talk about a British expedition to the south, in Sullivan's Island. Henry Clinton, prior to the Battle of Long Island, had been sent south to open up an offensive in the Carolinas and try to take land in the south while the rest of the British forces were preparing for the invasion of New York. Charles Lee, who I mentioned last episode, a general in the American forces, was sent south along with William Moultrie to defend against this attack. As mentioned in one of the primer episodes for the American Revolution, the British were unable to take Sullivan's Island. They attempted an amphibious landing but were rebuffed by the Continental forces, and their attempts at shelling the fort were also ineffective due to the sandy soil and the spongy nature of the palmetto logs that the fort was constructed of. Also, during this attack, the colonists were able to employ effective defensive fire, which frustrated the effort of the British and forced them to eventually give up. In what seems now to be a shockingly short-sighted decision, the British abandoned their efforts in the Carolinas and decided to move north to meet the rest of the British forces in New York. As Bill and I mentioned in episode 52, the failure to take Fort Sullivan, establish a presence in the South, and influence the public may have been one of the primary reasons the British eventually lost the war. We will see the British return to the South, but not until 1780, 4 years later. By this time, the entire composition of the conflict had changed, and it was a much taller task for the British. So, when we left off last episode up north, Washington had made mistake after mistake, splitting up his troops between Manhattan and Long Island, not defending the Jamaica Pass, and reinforcing a seemingly hopeless situation at Brooklyn Heights. Fortunately, Washington was able to salvage the best possible result from his situation, evacuating his men to Manhattan Island to live to fight another day, mostly because Admiral Howe did not place his Royal Navy in the East River to prevent his escape. Now, Washington had come to accept at this point that they were fighting a, quote, war of post, which more or less means a defensive war. Although Washington was wired to be a much more offensively minded soldier, he had learned his lessons, sometimes restraining himself and other times having to rely on his counsel to offer advice of restraint. But it is important to note that at the Battle of Long Island, Washington displayed this theory, a war of post, more or less defending strong fortifications. He did not have as many men, and those that he did not have the discipline in battle that he desired. Therefore, he knew that defending specific fortifications would give his men the best opportunity to survive. And this was important to Washington, because like I've said before, he was not impressed with his men, and in fact quite disappointed. At one point he lamented, quote, "The honor of making a brave defense does not seem to be a sufficient stimulus, when the success is very doubtful, and the falling into enemies' hands probable." Defending posts would keep these men out of the open field and hopefully provide them with enough reason to do their duty. On the other hand, it's probably useful to speak for a moment about what exactly Howe was planning. He figured that he would be able to cut the colonies in two if he could work up the Hudson while Carleton was working down from Canada. This way, he could destroy Washington piecemeal, and if he retreated, they would focus their energies on New England, force them into submission, and they figure subsequently the other colonies would fall in line. The biggest problem, though? Howe was totally risk-averse, as you are slowly coming to find out. But look, he wasn't alone. Lord Percy wrote in the summer of 1776 that, quote, "Our army is so small that we cannot even afford a victory." So Howe and his officers found himself, at least in his mind, in the classic situation that, quote, "the fate of battle, at best, are precarious." Howe and his officers always figured even a victory exposed them to great risk, and they were of the scarcity mindset, not the abundance mindset, and they were worried about losing too many men in any specific conflict. Now, as we'll cover in this podcast in the future, the Battle of Saratoga and the American victory changed the course of the war because it brought the French in and also reinvigorated the colonial cause, but not only that, it ruined the entire plan of the British. So, while I give Howe a hard time and his brother a hard time and some of their officers for delaying, a hard time that I think they deserve, if they won the Battle of Saratoga, the plan may have worked out anyway. But once Washington's men were settled in on Manhattan, things quickly devolved. Many of his Continental forces had their summer enlistments end in August and determined that their best next step in life was to abandon the army and not fight in this war. Meanwhile, Washington was trying his best to figure out what his next move was. He realized that New York was more or less an impossible place to defend, and he wanted to know what the Second Continental Congress wished he would do next. Allow Britain to take Manhattan and the colony of New York, or stay and fight in order to try to keep it out of their hands. On top of this, Washington's decisions on Long Island, along with some of his other questionable instincts and lack of career resume, have many of his men questioning whether or not he was really the right man for the job. It didn't help that Charles Lee was seen not only as a capable replacement, but potentially even an upgrade to Washington by many. Colonel John Haslett of Delaware wrote, quote, "Would to heaven if General Lee was here," was the language of officers and men. In a situation that seemed all too familiar, Washington did not know what to do and didn't know what Howe was going to do next, so he decided to spread his men thin while he tried to figure out next steps. But Washington wasn't just going to allow the British Navy to sit in the harbor, he was about to make history. On September 7th, the American Continental Forces deployed the first ever attempt at submarine warfare. That's right, in 1776. American inventor David Bushnell had developed an underwater explosive in 1775, and by 1776, they had figured out a way to attach it to a one-man submarine. The idea was that this submarine, nicknamed the Turtle, would be used to attach an explosive to the British ship, the Eagle. Unfortunately, when Sergeant Everett Lee tried to use it, the drill struck an iron band on the ship and could not penetrate it. When Lee had to come up to surface to reorient himself, a few small British ships were sent over towards him to see what the heck was going on. To fend them off, he released the explosives, and they went off in the East River without consequence. Not as exciting as maybe you had hoped. The Turtle was used a few more times during the war, but was never successful. Eventually, about a year later, the British sunk a transport ship that was carrying the Turtle, and that was the end of that. And I'll put up a drawing, a depiction of what the Turtle would have looked like on the Facebook page with all the links for this episode. While it did not have much of a practical impact on the war, obviously, the invention and employment of the Turtle was truly historical. But let's get back to the situation at hand. In early September, Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's most trusted generals, recommended that they evacuate New York and burn the Tory-loving city to the ground. He argued that another defeat would be absolutely crippling to the cause, and it would allow the British to take in all of the benefits of New York City. As they were considering evacuation, on September 7th, they were informed from the Second Continental Congress that they were not to burn the city of New York, but they should defend it. Also, the Second Continental Congress was sending a delegation of John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Edward Rutledge to negotiate with Admiral Howe. The delegation wasn't able to agree to terms, and Washington decided to abandon Manhattan and move north. And he did that after Howe landed at Kip's Bay and basically took all the options out of his hands. Washington expected a British landing, so he put about 500 Connecticut militia at Kip's Bay, building pretty lame ditches. Short on sleep and weapons, many of these men were actually armed with pikes. That's right, pikes. Howe wasn't going to make the mistake of sending his men into battle against an enemy that hadn't quite been softened up yet, so the Royal Navy shelled the militia for an hour, and then about 4,000 British troops began their amphibious landing. The Connecticut militia looked at them, probably looked at each other, and they began to throw their weapons to the ground and got the hell up out of there. As the men were beginning their retreat, Washington was arriving, baffled at their cowardice, and he became furious. Washington had always had a strong temper, but it was more often than not very restrained. But here, he flipped his lid. He beat his men with his riding cane, threw his hat on the ground, and screamed, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" In his blinding rage, Washington pushed as close as 100 yards of the approaching Hessians before his men were able to corral him off the battlefield. At this, the Americans began to hasten their retreat, and as they did that, two seemingly predictable things happened. Number one, the Hessians refused to honor surrender and once again massacred the American soldiers still fighting. Number two, General Howe delayed again, genuinely missing maybe his best opportunity to crush Washington's forces once and for all. Not only did his delay prevent him from capturing all of the men at Kip's Bay, but it also gave Israel Putnam and young Aaron Burr the time to evacuate the rest of the army from Manhattan as they took the little-known paths along the western edge of the island. Howe, likely, if he pushed, could have cut off the fleeing force and diced them up to pieces, but predictably, he took his sweet old time entering Manhattan and conservatively stayed on the east side of the island. Howe was quite pleased with the ease of the invasion of Manhattan, minimal bloodshed, and easy pickings. By nightfall, the American forces had retreated north and were on high ground at Harlem Heights, with their left flank on the Harlem River and their right flank against the Hudson. As the men retreated to Harlem Heights, Washington was still furious. He absolutely could not believe the cowardice of the Connecticut militia. While it was legitimate to determine the Connecticut men acted as cowards, any objective assessment of the engagement would have likely also determined that they were all going to die if they had stayed and fight, and it was probably a good idea to run. The following day, September 16, 1776, the American and British forces engaged in a small conflict on Harlem Heights. The American forces actually recorded a victory, even though it was quite small. The casualty losses were minimal, somewhere between 100 and 300 killed and wounded, but the victory was a confidence boost that the Americans needed, even if temporary. For the next month, both armies didn't make much of an advance. In the meantime, General Lee returned, and some soldiers, when they saw General Lee, could not hide the relief and elation, because at this point, Washington was on thin ice with many of them. Lee was shocked at the fact that the American troops were still trying to hold New York. He had rushed his way back up from South Carolina and was sure that they were not going to be silly enough to still be in New York. He put so much pressure on Washington and his men that they called a war council to see if, in fact, maybe they should leave. But Washington balked and wanted to fight it out. Lee was beside himself. At this point, Washington's relationship with Lee was strained, and he was still trying to figure out what the British were going to do next. Howe temporarily relieved this anxiety by landing 4,000 men at Throg's Neck, a little northeast of Harlem Heights. Not wanting to get trapped, Washington, on October 18th, began to slowly withdraw his men from Harlem Heights, and they were on a full retreat by October 21st, further north to White Plains, New York, about 25 miles north of Manhattan. Howe was kind once again, allowing Washington and his men to drag their artillery because they did not have enough wagons and horses. I mean, it took them 4 days just to get their stuff off of Harlem Heights, and Howe was just sitting there letting them do it. How nice of him. Washington, sort of inexplicably in retrospect, allowed Nathaniel Greene and 1,200 men to continue to defend Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, like there was really any chance of them having a significant impact or being able to defend it against thousands of British troops. And the British took it in November. Taking his sweet old time, though, Howe took about a week to finally move north towards White Plains, allowing Washington to gain the high ground and begin to build defensive works. Think about it. It had been 7 weeks. 7 weeks since General Howe had landed on Long Island, and he had only moved 35 miles and let Washington sneak away time and time again. On October 28th, the fighting commenced with the British outnumbering the colonists about 2-1. The fighting was intense and nothing too notable, just the British forces overpowering the colonists and forcing them into retreat. Each side lost a few hundred troops, and the British were able to push the Americans off the high ground. On October 31st, once again to the surprise of Howe, Washington was able to sneak away in an overnight retreat. I mean, seriously, Howe? Are you like the least decisive general ever? How does this continue to surprise you? Howe turned south, took care of Nathaniel Greene's troops at Fort Washington, and took total control of the island of Manhattan. Meanwhile, Washington and his men were a beaten bunch, retreating across the Hudson and living to fight another day. While Washington was trying to find a way to keep control of New York and fend off William Howe, there was a 21-year-old American spy sacrificing his life for the revolutionary cause. Born in 1775 and a graduate of Yale, Nathan Hale, who was close friends with Benjamin Talmadge, the founder of the Culper Spy Ring, decided that he was going to put his life on the line for the American cause. Talmadge had inspired Nathan Hale to join the Connecticut militia, and he ended up in New York preparing for the British invasion. While Washington was driving himself crazy trying to figure out the plans of the British prior to their invasion of Long Island, he asked for volunteers to spy, and Hale was the only one who spoke up. Nathan Hale volunteered to travel behind enemy lines to find out what he could about British plans and then report it back to Washington. While Hale was working as a spy, we know that General Howe and the British were outmaneuvering Washington, driving him from Long Island and from Manhattan. As Washington was retreating north to Harlem Heights in September, a fire broke out in New York City, nicknamed the Great Fire of New York. No one knows exactly who started it, but it was devastating to the city. General Howe was determined that it was a revolutionary saboteur, writing to London that, quote, a most horrid attempt was made by a number of wretches to burn the town. Howe wasn't the only one who believed this, and there were numerous other Britons and Americans who suspected it was done by a patriot. Even Washington wrote that, quote, Providence, or some good honest fellow, has done more for us than we were disposed to do for ourselves. The Great Fire of 1776 made the occupation of New York significantly more difficult for the British and less rewarding. The reason I bring up this fire is not only so you now have knowledge of it, but because this led to the eventual capture and death of one Mr. Nathan Hale. Following the fire, British suspicions ran extremely high, understandably, and the Redcoats rounded up hundreds of loyal patriots. The competing stories of Hale's capture either claim that he was fooled into conversation, giving himself away, or he was betrayed by a loyalist cousin. Either way, Hale was captured and thoroughly questioned by General Howe. Without trial, Nathan Hale was sentenced to death. The British took the letters that he had written home to his family and tore them up right in front of him at the gallows. One final punishment before his hanging. Prior to pulling the noose, it is believed that Nathan Hale, comporting himself well, stated, quote, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." No one really knows if Hale said this or not, but is it really that important? I mean, the message is clear. Additionally, Frederick Mackenzie, a British officer, wrote this diary entry for the day. Quote, "He behaved with great composure and resolution, saying he thought it the duty of every good officer to obey any orders given him by his commander-in-chief, and desired the spectators to be at all times prepared to meet death in whatever shape might appear." And just to make things perfectly confusing regarding Mr. Hale, there are about 4 different sites in Manhattan that claim to be his hanging site. So there are a lot of unknowns about him. What is known, though, is that he genuinely was a hero of the revolution and one of the brave men that sacrificed his life for what he believed would one day become his country. As you pack up your things, consider the situation that Washington once again found himself in, crossing the Hudson into New Jersey. The British had taken Manhattan and subsequently Newport, Rhode Island without opposition. He then sent General Cornwallis's forces into New Jersey to chase George Washington. Washington's men were at their lowest point of morale of the entire conflict, and he knew he needed to do something fast or he would lose them, emotionally, psychologically, and quite literally. He did just that, counter-striking at Trenton and Princeton with some pretty awesome strategy and execution. We will cover that next week. Oh, and I also have an exciting announcement about a bonus episode that will be posted on the Patreon page next week too. So if you've been considering becoming a supporting patron of the show but haven't gotten around to it, now would be a good time. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate, please feel free to reach out on Twitter at A Teacher's Hist. You can find us on Facebook, A Teacher's History of the United States. Email me, chris@ateachershistory.com. And if you could sign up to support the show on Patreon, that would mean a ton. All right, see you next week.